off, welcome to Book Talk, or should I say History Mystery, which is a very special event we're doing as a part of Tulika's 30th birthday celebrations this month. And this is one of the many things we're doing. And very excited to be chatting with Devika Cariapa and Ashwin Prabhu. For those of you who may not already be aware of who these two are, let me give you a quick introduction to each of them. We'll start with Devika. So, Devika Cariapa is an archaeologist by training, and she combines her love for writing with her passion for history. Her earlier books with Tulika are 25 Game Changers and India Through Archaeology, Excavating History, which won the Hindu Young World Good Books Award in 2018 and the Sahitya Academy's Bal Sahitya Puraskar in 2019. Next, of course, we have Ashwin Prabhu. So his meanderings have taken him into the worlds of banking, teaching, heritage education, writing, and the development sector. His first book, Classroom with a View, Notes from the Krishnamurti Schools, came out in 2022. He enjoys working with teachers and children in thematic areas where philosophy, history, art, and literature happily intersect. His first book with Tulika was Sculpted Stones. And we have one more book coming out with him very soon called Magnificent Murals, so stay tuned for that. But thank you to both of you for being here today. Really excited to talk to both of you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. And happy birthday, Tulika. 30 years. That's amazing. Birthday wishes are in order. Happy birthday, Tulika.
Yes, happy birthday to Tulika indeed. And to kick off, so first thing I want to ask both of you is, how did your interest in writing, begin for each of you, and what motivated each of you to write for children? Devika, would you like to take that first?
Okay. um, so writing per se, like the interest in writing goes way, way back in my BCE era when I was in school. And it was a very big part of the school curriculum where we were taught that, I don't know if either of you remember, we had this thing called composition
Yeah.
in English class. Do you?
Yeah, yeah.
So, we would be so enthusiastic about it, and our teachers would be equally enthusiastic. They were so particular: grammar, sentence structure, punctuation, everything was very, very carefully sort of, monitored. And we found it such a challenge. It was for the imagination as well as the function, the functional part of writing. And from there, I think we developed an interest in reading and writing together. So that was how the writing part, and you know, um, I always joke that certain unnamed people started novels at the age of 11, which ended at chapter one and a half. So we would all be doing that, incipient novels as a, preteen sort of thing. And then, of course, it sort of tapers off when you are studying and then working and so on. The writing gets a little slower, and reading also, sometimes you fall off that because you're involved in academics or otherwise. But the love of writing and reading really does not leave you once you've gotten into it. And about how I started writing for children, it was around the time that I started training to be an archaeologist, and two things happened. One is that the world of our material remains, the immense world of India's material remains, were sort of visible to me, and I was made more aware of it. And my teachers and professors were these marvelous people who had done all this work to bring it to light and to write these books and so on. But somehow that was not translating into what into readers, like non-academic readers would be able to read. So there was a big sort of a lacuna between the work, the very exciting work being done in archaeology in India, and what was the perception of people who like to read but were not reading these things because obviously the books were very academic and technical and so on. And the second thing was that I studied prehistory, and it's a pretty dry subject. Like, you literally are looking at bones and stones, and most of the time you're sort of ankle deep in dust. And we'd be taken on these excavations and we'd walk along dry river beds and you'd be sort of tiptoeing over these pebbles, thousands and thousands of pebbles. And the professor would pick up one out of that and say, look at this one. How is it different? This has been touched by a human who lived more than 100,000 years ago. And from the structure of that pebble, we had to trace the story of that stone, and the key there is really the story. So those objects were telling stories. And I just thought this is just wonderful and children have to hear about this. But of course, it took me many, many years after that before I actually started writing. So that's the backstory of writing nonfiction.
Okay, that's lovely. And Ashwin, for you?
No, I think I want to start by saying how fascinating that was, Devika, listening to you speak about your reading and writing journey. And I have to confess that both me and my 13-year-old son are big fans.
Ah, how lovely
uh,
is that?
yeah, right from excavating history, right? So I think it's been an absolute pleasure reading what you write, because it was lovely to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, as to how these ideas kind of germinated, right? But to kind of cycle back to the question, I think writing for me possibly had its origin in my reading habit as a child.
Okay.
And it seemed like, at one level, a very natural extension of being a voracious kind of reader. And I still think I have some samples of my writing as a child, which I've kept
Okay.
Yeah.
hidden away, which will not see the light of day. But I think thinking of childhoods filled with long summer afternoons with nothing else to do but reading. So, and I was an omnivore when it came to books, right? I practically devoured everything within reaching distance, within arm's distance, so whatever book that was. So I think that love of the written word is something which gradually developed into an urge to express oneself through the act of writing. And at one level, writing to me seems like a very intuitive and organic extension of reading, thinking, and then responding to what you're reading and thinking about through the act of writing, right? So that's one part of the answer to your question. But why do I write for children, and what has helped me write for children? I think there's a two-part answer to that. One is my own role as a father and reading aloud for my son for many years now. And I've been doing it for, I think, he's 13. I've been doing it ever since I think he was 2. Almost every evening ended with me reading aloud something to him as I put him to bed.
Okay.
And I think in the process of doing that, watching him quietly and observing what he's responding to, what he seems to enjoy, what catches his fancy, right? What does he want to talk about? So what are his follow-up questions on? That kind of gave me a little bit of a window into how a child's mind works, right? But following that up with my stint as a teacher in a school, which is not something which I had planned, right? I am an accidental teacher, but finding myself in the classroom, I taught history exactly the way I learned history. Uh,
Okay.
Only to discover very soon, I think the vast portion of my class wasn't enjoying it the way I expected them to. And that got me thinking about how does a child's mind work and how does the learning mind work, right? And I think both these experiences, one as a parent, but also as a teacher of being with young people and books, got me thinking about is there something which I could possibly contribute to this? And I think that's where it happened from.
Okay. Nice. I feel like I resonated with both your answers in sense because I think even for me, my love of language started in English class. I think that was the first place. And also even, reading was something I did a lot as a child. And I think my grandmother was the one who really introduced me to books and I got reading over there. So I kind of like really, sort of resonated in that sense with the whole reading and writing aspect. But you know what I also want to ask is, okay, both of you predominantly write nonfiction and in the space of sort of history and archaeology. What do you find challenging about conveying this, so much of technical and factual information to children?
Devika, you want to go first?
No, I was just going to say, Ashwin, you
Maybe
go.
Ashwin should take this first and then
All
probably
right.
touch the
We'll
last
do
bit.
it in turns, okay?
Yeah.
We'll go
Yeah.
back and forth.
It's only
Yeah,
the alternate, I guess.
yeah.
But yes, I think, like I told you, I started teaching history very much the way I learned it. Is really as a bundle of facts and pieces of information, right? And pieces of knowledge, so to speak. Um, so I tended to overemphasize the informational aspects of the subject because that's the way I'd learned it, and I'd always had a head for facts and figures and names and places, and I kind of soaked it all up as a child. But I think the mistake I made was to assume that everyone learns that way. So I think the first insight was that I think people process the world in different ways, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. So to take a subject like history and reduce it to just an assorted set of facts and factoids, um, seemed to suggest that it was for only one kind of reader or learner, right? And I think that was the beginning of working with different ways of engaging children through the subject. And I think one insight I've had is that the entry point to exploring an area of history needn't always be a fact. We typically use a fact as the entry point into exploration of the subject. But what if the entry point was something else, right? And I think what I learned very quickly is that content is one way of approaching this, but contact is another, right? So to put things in perspective, getting children out of the classroom, right? And if we were to learn about a fort, for example, that fort is within traveling distance, I rather first take the child to the fort, right? Have him or her touch it and feel it and walk around and see where it's geographically located and how does your heart beat when you walk up the steps and what it does to you physically, right? So give that kind of visceral experience of observing something, physical history, right? So then that act of observation becomes the entry point, right? And not so much who built this fort in which year, right? Or what battle was fought at that fort. Now, I think the nuance here is this approach allows for everyone to participate in the process, right? And not just for that one child who perhaps knows the answer to that one question on who built the fort or when was it built. So then the classroom and the learning becomes a far more inclusive kind of process. Now, if you were to extend that to the act of writing, how would you take something like nonfiction and history to children? The way I write in the Mamallapuram book and in the Ajanta book as well, it's really the visual which is the hero of the book, right? The writing is incidental, right? So the writing is light to the extent that it's just a gently guiding hand, right? The bulk of the work, the heavy lifting, is actually done by the visual aspects of the book. And there's a reason I do that because if I can't take them physically to a place, the next best thing I can do is perhaps show them a striking visual of the place and use that as a starting point in getting them to observe carefully, describe what they're observing. And in the process of describing that, the first questions will emerge. That will take them down a train of inquiry and exploration. And there is a place for facts and names and all of that. But that comes a little later, I think, in the engagement process. So really, this is the kind of approach I'm trying to take forward in my writing as well, where I get them to engage first, and then perhaps explore the informational aspects of it later.
Okay. And Devika, for you?
Yeah, I mean, you've done it fabulously in your Mamallapuram book, Ashwin. It's really, it literally grabs your attention as an adult, as a child, as a young person. It would be even more so a very different way of approaching history. As you said, it's more, a child who is not interested would automatically be attracted by a visual first, and then you can draw them in. It's like a little bit of a game that history teachers would play, I think. But in my case, I think the biggest challenge to me for writing, in writing nonfiction, is the research for an academic. You have a very it's a sort of a pinpoint that you are now researching one aspect of history, or archaeology. But what happens when you're writing for young people is that your research has to be that much more. It extends your, because you have to find perspective, you have to put perspective in for the young reader, and also you have to do so much research because you are now looking for that entry point, which cannot be a dry fact. You have to find the story. You're literally sort of, in those lucky dips that you did with sawdust and stuff, you're sort of reaching, the sawdust tub is your research, and you're reaching into that sawdust and you're looking for that one interesting entry point into that particular period or that subject or whatever it is that you're trying to introduce. So I think the research and more research is really the biggest challenge in writing for young people.
Okay, that's really interesting.
That, Sangeetha, I think Devika, you do it so wonderfully well in this book on children's history of India in 100 objects. And I think that kind of speaks to some of what I was attempting to explain, which is a lot of history which children are going to learn first is material history, is physical history, right? So conceptual history comes a little later, I think, in their years of learning. But if physical objects and physical structures are what they're going to engage with first, then I think there's an opportunity there for us to be able to put them in contact with that physical heritage, right? And I think this book of learning the history of a civilization or of a geography through 100 physical objects, I think is a fantastic premise.
It's also a contextualization. They are taken to museums and the displays are there for them to see, but really there's no context at all. So the first chapter of excavating history, it's called Stories from Stones. I wanted to introduce. I'll just show you
Yeah.
the chapter. It's so nicely done by Tulika again. It's introducing the prehistory of India to young people. Now, again, as I said, it's prehistory is a pretty dry kind of a subject, but then I kind of realized that these two rather uh, drab looking stones in the museum in Chennai, if one were to say, but they have such an exciting history. So I use that as the introduction and the stories that came out of those stones to introduce prehistory. So you'll always find a point, like Ashwin's used, those marvelous sculptures of Mahabalipuram as a introduction to, that
Yeah.
particular era. So there's that. That is the challenge, to find that spot, I think.
Yeah. And I think what was really interesting, if I may add, about Mamlapuram is also, I think once the book came out, we also did like a few of these programs where we took school children to, the space, and we kind of did this sort of tour of the place. And Ashwin was there. He was kind of, taking the kids around and with the book as a guide and everything. So I think that was really nice. And I think the kids really were very engaged. And it was nice to see that sort of live learning also happening with the book and with
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
structure in a way. But yeah, I mean, having said that, today information is so readily available and accessible, and I think kids are so much more tech savvy and just have so much more exposure, right? So in an age like this, how do you kind of get kids to sort of consume nonfiction and especially history through books? Is that ever something both of you think about?
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising that I think the best way is to let the reader lead the way, like let them pick what interests them. Because the moment you say, oh, you as the adult or the parent pick up the book and say, I think you should read it, uh, children can sense a textbook moment from a mile away. They will say, okay, this is incoming textbook, beep, beep, So there are, like, I've done some of these nonfiction workshops, which have been wonderful for Tulika. And Sangeetha, you were there
Yeah.
for some of them. There are children with very specific interests.
Yeah.
Like there was one little boy who was obsessed with spiders. Somebody was obsessed with the stars, and someone with space. And we could see a little telescope in the back of his room. So he was serious. So if they are allowed to pick the
Yeah.
non-fiction books that they like, it can only be good, because from that one non-fiction book, they will discover that there's a world of non-fiction, and then they might just learn, pick up history, although it's not their particularly favorite subject, or something on geology, or I don't know. Ashwin, yeah, what do you think is a good introduction to?
Yeah, I think there's also this misplaced sense of a notion that non-fiction has to be text heavy or information heavy, right? I think kind of gets internalized that way. Whereas fiction is fun, it's pacey, it's racy, it's entertaining. But non-fiction is really for, if I may use that word, the nerds, right?
Yeah.
I want to kind of
Yeah.
wrestle with that idea a little and kind of challenge that idea. So I think my approach has been to de-emphasize the informational aspects. I'm talking non-fiction here. We're not talking fantasy. But hey, guess what? I'm not going to kind of unleash a flood of information on you in the first few pages, but I'm going to kind of get you to warm up to the subject. And then when you are ready, and hopefully I can recognize that moment when you're ready to learn in a more conventional textual manner about this. So that information then becomes available at that point in time. So to kind of put things in perspective, at least we have done it with the Mamallapuram book and we're doing it again with the Ajanta book. In fact, the very last chapter in both these books are titled A Little History,
Yeah.
right? So it's almost challenging the idea that a non-fiction book on history and art and architecture needs to open with facts. So we're saying we'll come to the history right at the very end, right? So there is a place for information, and it does, I think, inform you of things which you need to know to be able to kind of connect the dots at a much, much higher plane of understanding. But we can get to it in good time, right? So uh, one way of, like you say, the dry informational aspects, and also we live in an age where I think there's an abundance of information.
Yeah.
There's an abundance
Yeah.
of nuggets of information and trivia and all of it. So I think my own thinking on this is to kind of de-emphasize the information. Hey, can we engage with something else? So I'm interested in understanding what you're observing and how you're describing and why are you saying what you're saying, right? So it's almost conversational, though of course the writer is not physically present, but I'm hoping that you can enter into some kind of conversation and kind of get a peek into what the reader is thinking as you go along through the pages of the book. So that's
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I also, when Devika mentioned, right, like kids, I think the minute they sense there's this sort of textbook school vibe going on, there is a, resistance towards, whatever it might be. But then, having said that, what do you think, especially as, writers and educators, what are some things you think can be done to sort of inculcate that interest in kids, right, when it comes to, nonfiction and history specifically?
Ashwin, are you going to
Ashwin, do you
lead
want to
this?
do you want to take that? Yeah.
I think engagement is key, right? And that's central to children kind of participating and enjoying in the reading process, right? So writing in a style which allows for that kind of engagement, right? Either through questions or through dialogue, right? So I think I would also, specifically speaking about children's literature, I would also like to propose that I think a book is not just written in isolation, but a book is meant to be consumed in dialogue as well. So you read the book, that's good, that's a great start. But I think the job of the book is not done there. In fact, it's a starting point, right? So what does reading of that book do to you? Does it encourage conversation around what you've learned in the book, right? Do you have questions? Is there a way for you to follow through on those questions, right? So that kind of open-ended, participative approach, which essentially results in engagement, I think is our only chance in getting children to kind of inculcate an interest in these subjects.
Devika,
Yeah,
please.
I think school engagement, because Ashwin, you mentioned you're a teacher, so you know the challenge because the curriculum has its sort of structure and space, and there may not be enough time or in the classroom to sort of to do these sideways readings and so on. But say an author takes the book to a school and then has the conversation that we're talking about. Maybe they've read the book, maybe they haven't, maybe but I find it very effective when I'm talking to school children. They immediately say, "Oh, we didn't know this, but what do you think of that?" and so on. And a lot of them claim in the beginning not to understand, not to like history and so on. But at the end of the session, they're like engaged in that book or that conversation that we've had. So perhaps some of these, spreading the word, so to speak, into schools and classrooms would be a good way to, to draw them into the world of specifically history nonfiction.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think it's really about engaging the child, as both of you, rightly said. Again, kind of for me, going back, my maternal grandmother, she was a history student, and she'd have this way of like storytelling, and she'd kind of, talk about like her time during growing up during independence and partition and all of that. So, and she'd make it very engaging. So I think just doing that can really, like, as a child, draw you in for sure. So completely agree with both of you are saying. But also something else I was curious about is, as writers, do both of you sort of decide the books that you're going to write, or do publishers approach you with sort of a general list of options, say, of what you could write? And also, does it interest you to sort of, I guess, work with different subjects within your sort of general domain? Devika, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. Like initially, when I started out, I obviously had these ideas about archaeology, and I had to approach the publisher and ask them and so on. So once I've started writing a little bit, now I find some ideas coming from publishers, and with Tulika, it's always very exciting because they're always pushing the boundaries. You see, as a writer, as an author, I would have a particular idea of what I want. I essentially base everything in material evidence or something. But uh, if a publisher with the imagination and the let's say the perspective that Tulika has approaches me and says, now this is what we've thought about. And there's always something where they're pushing the boundaries in terms of production, in terms of format, in terms of whatever approachable way that we could put very complex information. It can only enhance my writing. So I find that very, very exciting. For instance, I've written my very first and hopefully not last picture book, history picture book with Tulika,
Uncle
which
Nehru.
came, yeah, exactly,
It's,
which came
it's
exactly.
right here.
There you go. So that came entirely from, I wouldn't have been able to, perhaps not the courage, or I don't know, but thanks to them, I could write a historical nonfiction picture book. So it works both ways. I love the ideas that come, and I hope that I put enough effort and my own chops into it as well.
Yeah. Ashwin, for you?
No, no, I just wish publishers would approach me with with project ideas. Sadly, that hasn't happened. Not
It's
for
just the beginning.
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
exactly.
on that. So I think the writing I've done so far has largely been me feeling like there's something which I would like to share, and perhaps there's somebody else besides me who's going to find it interesting, and I kind of I bounce these ideas of publishers, and then if there is consensus on that shared sense of excitement, so then we move forward. So that's been what's happened so far. But having said that, I think in the process of writing and working with a publisher, it's been a tremendous learning process for me, because I think there is very much what Devika was talking about, which is an editorial eye, right? So I think it takes a skilled and perceptive editor to be able to see a book idea, or get on to something which the editor knows is going to work with the child, right? So there's very definitely, I think, that kind of editorial insight which an editor brings, a good editor brings along in the writing process. And I think a writer is richer for that, right? So it's very much a collective process, this process of writing, right? So you come in with an initial idea and you have a sense of what you want to kind of say and how you want to say it. And then you enter into this very long gestation kind of writing process, right? So where several editors are taking a look at you, then you bring in an illustrator, and then there's the designer as well. So I think it's a happy amalgam of all of this. And I think the book is richer for that.
Yeah, no, and I'm just going to quickly show Ashwin's book as well, Sculpted Stones, right
Beautiful.
here.
Yeah.
We don't have magnificent murals yet. It's coming. It's on the way, so we'll show that soon as well. But yeah, I mean, another thing I wanted to ask you, and this was something that briefly came up, was research. What does your research process look like for a book for each of you? Is there a sort of structure both of you have in terms of approaching a story or a book when you have an idea and there's something you want to write about? Ashwin, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this for some time, and I think Devika hit the nail on the head very early on in this conversation, right? Saying research is integral to writing about some of these subjects which we have spoken of for children. And if anything, I think one needs to be a little more meticulous, a little more careful, and a little more selective about what the findings of your own research you're going to take, right? Because there are strands there which are important and also something which will hold appeal to the reader, young reader, right? So I think research is key. Um, Having said that, what I've experienced in these two books which I've written with Tulika is that quite honestly, a lot of research can be done at the desk, right?
Okay.
Given the world we live in, there is an abundance of good quality scholarship available already on which one can build on. But having said that, I also find myself somewhat old-fashioned that I find that it's very important for me to actually physically visit the place I'm writing about as much as possible. Because in that physical visit, there's something which is very intangible, but yet I think very important, which happens, right? So you're connecting to that at a relational level, which goes beyond just the aspect of knowledge of right. And I think usually I find the hooks for young readers in those visits. So Mahabalipuram, for example, I've been going there now for the last almost 10 years, at least 10 to 12 times in a year. And every time I visit, I notice something new. I find something new which just blows my breath away. Right? So I find this act wherever possible of actually visiting a place I'm writing about very, very informative in that sense. Or it informs a lot of my writing. So to that extent, I think that's also part of the research process, right? But I also recognize that it may be possible at times, and other times it's just not going to be possible, right? If you're writing about, let's say, Mohenjo-daro, how many times are you going to be able to visit the place? So, yeah, so that's a bit of the challenge.
Yeah. Devika, for you?
Yeah, it depends on the book. Like the three books that I've written for Tulika are very different. Each one of them. The archaeology book obviously came from vast amount of research because I've tried to cover from prehistory to almost modern day in terms of. So that was a very deep dive into archaeology, and the challenge there was to pull out things that would suit the period and to represent them through some kind of material remains. So that was one. But in the other book, which is called India Through People, 25 Game Changers, Diya, Radhika, the editors and all picked people that we felt had changed the face of modern India. So we had a list of over 100 people, and then we had to hone it down to 25 that we felt were actual, like, very, very significant game changers. And then we had to bring in these little for instance, somebody, these were only born between 1850 and later, and so on. We had to make slight qualifications. So that was a different thing because in 25 of those, I had to deep dive into the biographies of 25 different people, men, women from all different parts of India with different professions from different backgrounds and so on. So that kind of research was very different. Then, say, the picture book. It was meant to be about Nehru and how children from around the world asked him for live elephants. And I approached the book thinking, okay, this is going to be a little simpler than the other books, because we are only talking about the elephants. There were limited number of elephants. And to my surprise, I discovered a much more complex story as I was researching and looking at the archives and looking at the letters. It was a complex story about India itself, India herself, being a different kind of a country post partition and post independence, a country that young people today would not recognize. It was obviously devastated through war and through colonialism. And they were trying to set up their place in the world through this thing called diplomacy. And diplomacy involved animals. And what of those animals? Like today, for instance, if somebody asks for a live elephant, I'm thinking that nobody would really, you know, sort of pander to that kind of a request. But it became a slightly more complex or layered story, although it is for young people. So the research process, I think, Ashwin, also you mentioned going to Mamalipuram for 10 years. I'm sure you would find more and more as you go. You could probably write another book based on what you've seen over the 10 years. So the research process varies, and the more you practice putting across to young people, the more you see things perhaps that would interest them
Yeah.
in that story, because it is very layered. No, our past is extremely layered, and
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because yeah, I mean, it's usually, especially history is not very easy to write about. There's so much to read, there's so
yeah.
much information available, and to kind of taper that down also is a challenge in
Mhm.
itself, as both of you know.
Yeah.
But now that both of you have been writing for children, and you've been teaching as well, what's the most memorable thing a child has said to you about your writing? Devika, do you want to go first, or Ashwin, do you
Yeah,
want to go first?
I can't, it's been it's sort of strangely uniform all over. They will come to me with the book or whatever to post a session or something, and they'll say, ma'am, we never liked history before, but now we really like it." To me, oh, my mission here is done. It's complete. So
That's
there have been
lovely.
variations of that sentiment. I take that as the greatest compliment. It's a great sort of it keeps me going.
Ashwin, for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to recollect one specific thing which happened. But let me put it this way, right? Usually children catch you by surprise. So you're out there thinking that they're going to like one part of your book which you thought was the most appealing, and then almost always it's something else. Right? So, for example, I remember in the Mahabalipuram book, I thought that maybe they would like, let's say, the Great Penance, the
Right.
Great Penance.
Mm.
But usually, I've seen that children respond in many, many different ways. For example, all the girl readers were fascinated by the woman warrior, right? Who
Okay.
comes
Ah,
much
yeah.
later in the book. The fact that there could be someone who was so strong and wielding a sword and leading an army kind of caught their fancy, right? So it's I think remarkable how children kind of consume the written word and the meaning making which happens in their minds, right? So it's almost always very instructive for a writer.
Yeah. But also, have your interactions, with kids, influenced your own approach to writing? Have you noticed that? Is that something you've done consciously? Ashwin, do you want to take that first?
I don't know. I think if there's one thing I understand, I think children usually appreciate humor. And I think history can do with a little bit of humor. So I remember the little cartoons, Devika, in your book, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Ashok
history. Yeah.
Rajagopalan's, yeah,
I
yeah,
think those are fantastic,
yeah.
right? So I think infusing a subject like history with some kind of humor, I think is very important. And most times it doesn't have to be a forced fit, right? It's usually something which is always already there, and it just requires that little bit of careful observation or perceptive eye to see it, right? And to recognize that this is something which young readers will value and will appreciate. So I think I usually try and see if I can bring in some humor into the writing. But apart from that, I haven't really thought much about that.
Devika, you?
Yeah, I feel the same way as Ashwin. Actually, it's initially I thought that because it's nonfiction, I'm extremely careful about how I put a fact across. Like every sentence is sort of weighed before I put it on the page. But I've realized that it's not bad to express an opinion, or it's not. It's probably a good idea because they pick up on that. Yeah, it's narrative after all. You're telling a story. So the more story like and a bit of humor will always help. A little bit of, sarcasm or a little bit of something, in a mild fashion, it goes
Wordplay.
a long way.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Wordplay, I mean.
Wordplay, yeah, exactly. Yeah. They appreciate that, I think. If I were to make it more effective, I think these were the things that I would put in.
Okay. And finally, last question. What is something that you've learned and that you'd like to share with other aspiring writers? Who'd like to take this
Are we
first?
talking about young aspiring writers or
Both.
just generally aspiring
Yeah,
writers?
both. If you have different pieces of advice for both, also, that go ahead.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I always repeat this, and everyone must be so bored of me saying it by now, but I do say one of my favorite authors, and it always resonates with me. Reading is the guru of writing. So you must read, and although counterintuitive coming from a non-fiction writer, please read as much fiction as you possibly can, and then just keep reading and reading and reading, because somewhere in that fiction, you will find voices that come to you. And when you start writing, your voice will be very unique, and which is also why young readers, a lot of them now come. Young readers come and say, "Oh, I want to write a book.
Yeah.
I have written a book, or I have published a book," or something like that. And to me, I feel perhaps you should wait till your voice is your own voice, and you're
Yeah.
not like, take it's natural if you're a young reader and you haven't read that much, that you will perhaps be uh, going in the sort of in the shadow of some one of your favorite authors or something. It's always better to wait and make yourself a very mature reader before you start writing. That's my opinion.
Ashwin, for you?
No, I can see what Devika is saying, right? So, writing, especially by the young, is seen as something which is very aspirational, right? So, every young reader wants to be a writer, and aspirational quality about it. Um, and like Devika said, perhaps it makes sense to wait for some time, right? Which actually links to what I want to say, which is I think many a time writing is often seen as for people with some kind of literary flair, right? Who can write eloquently, fluently, and it's often confused to be an exercise of language. But perhaps what I want to submit, especially let's say the kind of books we are writing about, I'm not so sure it's actually about language and literary flair and all of that, right? It's about something else. So writing is just the vehicle through which you're communicating an idea, right? So to that extent, it's not so much about the actual putting together of words as it is about what's in your head. What is it that you're trying to communicate, right? And I think that kind of marries quite well with what Devika is saying. So do you have something to say in your head? Or are you interested in just the act of writing? Because writing is incidental in one way. So once you really have that aha moment and saying, okay, this is interesting, and I'm guessing that it's interesting not just for me, but it's going to be interesting for many more people, right? So how do I take it to them? So writing then becomes a mere vehicle of transmitting that kind of enthusiasm and energy, right? I want to try and encourage people to look at it a little differently and saying a book is not so much about the writing as it is about what is that one insight which you have, which you want to share
Your own voice,
with others.
your unique voice. Otherwise, you're like, as you said, it's an exercise in language. You need to find your own unique voice, and that's what makes a really effective kind of piece of writing.
Yeah. And on that lovely note, we have now come to the end of this conversation. Thank you, Devika and Ashwin, for being here. It was so lovely talking to both of you. I didn't even realize time going by.
Yeah, I think what we've ended already. No,
And it's
lovely.
45
It was,
dot, so I think we can pat ourselves on the back.
No, but
yeah, yeah.
But absolutely enjoyable, and birthday wishes to Tulika again, and
thank you so much.
lots of celebration.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you,
Thank you,
Sangeetha and
Devika.
Tulika. It was lovely chatting with you.
Yes, likewise. And hopefully, we will see you soon at the bookstore. But yes, thank you once again.
Thank you.
I hope that I can join one of Ashwin's walks to Mamallapuram, or maybe Ajanta once that happens.
Oh,
Looking forward to
that's
that
so.
very much. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank
you.
Bye bye.
Bye.